Hi, I'm Jane Peterson of the Human Systems Institute. Roles, responsibilities, relationships inside of a company or an organization, these constitute the structure of an organization. Sometimes structures work well and sometimes they don't. Of course, they're made by human beings. So I want to share a story. This is the case of the poison contract. A colleague of mine was hired a while back to head up a highly placed legal department inside a large company. The VP of Legal and Finance was his boss. My colleague was given an important project that involved implementing a new system. And yet, every time he attempted to move forward with the project, a particular member of his team would go to the VP, and the VP himself would redirect the efforts of the team. When my colleague confronted his boss, the VP assured him of his support. However, every time he tried to grab hold of the leadership of the project, this duo would interfere. He found himself sandwiched between his boss and somebody who supposedly worked for him. Eventually, he left in frustration, and he felt that he had somehow failed. Upon further investigation, it turned out that the team member and the VP were longtime friends, and that this project that the VP had assigned to my colleague was one that he himself really wanted to do. When we join an organization, especially one that's been around a while, we assume that we should be able to make our workplace functional. And then when it doesn't work out, we wonder what's wrong with us. Now, sometimes we can change ourselves or the way that we work to improve our performance. And yet, as this little picture shows, I'm going to share my screen right now, sometimes it's not us. Sometimes, as this quote says, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted in a profoundly sick organization. So we've all seen or heard organizations that just don't seem to be working right. If you think about it, it's a miracle that organizations can grow so big, so fast these days. What happens along the way? As an organization grows, it has to develop hierarchies and specializations in order to handle the increasing complexity of its operations. So hierarchy, though most of us don't like it, it's inevitable in organizations. And while there are a few counterexamples of uniquely organized companies, there aren't many because it's hard to do. So this makes it kind of obvious that companies and other organizations actually grow in kind of ad hoc ways rather than by design. And this is necessary because we don't always know what we're going to need and we don't know what's going to work as we scale our organization. However, in this process of growth, organizations often end up creating roles, relationships, and expectations of employees, that is structure, that doesn't work very well. For example, we may have a health organization where physicians in one part of the organization are autonomous and not accountable to the administration that provides all the services that they need. So that sets up a natural tension between these two parts of an organization. Or a company can create one of those dreaded matrices where you end up with multiple bosses. One may be your quote line manager, another one is responsible for a large project that you're a part of, and somehow you end up with no real clear line of leadership. Organizations typically grow by adapting to their situation over time and then attempt to improve their operations after the fact by redesigning themselves. Of course, these kinds of change initiatives face the inertia of the existing organization. And let's face it, change is hard. So we end up with all kinds of systems and issues inside our companies, our nonprofits, and our governments that don't necessarily function as well as they could, and sometimes not at all. On top of this, as my earlier story shows, we're tribal creatures, and we like to work with people we trust. So because of that, we tend to create informal networks of trust inside hierarchies. Who we go to for this, who we go to for that. So we end up with an informal organizational structure hidden inside the official org chart. This is well documented by the work of Stevenson an anthropologist who painstakingly mapped the interactions between individuals within an organization. And her work can be accessed at netformresources.com. That's NETFORM resources.com. And she shares her findings of the kinds of informal networks that form within these larger hierarchies. So we have multiple layers of structure going on inside an organization. And it's often possible to feel like that woman in the box, doing your best, and yet the place just doesn't seem to work. So what can we do if we suspect that the structure of our organization isn't as coherent as would be optimal? A health test that you can apply to a structure inside an organization or even an organization that I'd like to offer you involves 3 dimensions. And if these 3 dimensions align well, there can be a sense of coherence and kind of a sense of making sense in the workplace. The first dimension is context. What an organization does, what it's organized around doing, needs to meet the group of people or provide the service or provide the widget that people want, that it has to serve a need, a real need. So for example, Spanx has a real devoted group of customers. It serves at least the need for improving appearance, or 3D printed medical parts that make something that you couldn't make very easily otherwise. They meet a real need. And if a company doesn't adapt to the way people are living, like Kodak didn't adapt as digital film replaced physical film, then it won't continue forever. Unfortunately, governments have found ways around this and continue to persist in certain areas, even when they don't necessarily meet function anymore. But this idea of whatever the company is doing, whether it's an NGO serving a group of people, it needs to be congruent with the people that it serves. And that means that this second dimension, purpose, has to align with meeting that need. Now, this seems really obvious, like the purpose of a company should indeed address what it's there to do. However, if you understand how systems behave and how organizations can sort of morph over time, you can see how we can end up with kind of covert purposes that undermine the actual purpose of the organization. For example, you may have a family-owned import business where the real purpose is to keep all the family members employed, not necessarily provide the best imports at the best price to customers. Or, for example, the Forest Service in a number of places might originally be tasked with maintaining the health of this very important resource. But over time, because this resource also has commercial value, gradually the informal organizational purpose becomes meeting the needs of the large corporations that profit from forest products such as palm oil or lumber. So the purpose has been sort of diverted and no longer necessarily aligns with the original context, the needs of that context. So for example, for various reasons here in the Pacific Northwest of the US, our forest management began to suppress fires, wildfires. While this preserved valuable stands of timber, it also allowed undergrowth to build up. And as the climate has changed and warmed, instead of having these normally wet forests that are less likely to burn, in this year in particular, we've had very dry conditions in the mountains. So that combined with a freakish windstorm took small fires that would easily be contained and turned them into deadly raging infernos. So because our Forest Service sort of, nobody planned this, but it ended up having to serve 2 purposes. We've ended up in a place that nobody would wish. So structure, purpose, and context are the 3 dimensions we need to have aligned. And structure, assuming that the purpose is really clear, it hasn't been diverted to some other means, and that it really matches the context. Those two dimensions make it possible for us to look at our structure and create a structure, the kinds of roles and relationships and responsibilities that serve the purpose, which serves the context. For example, a pizza delivery business doesn't need a customer service center. It has other ways of ensuring that pizzas are delivered on time that work better. So structure of organization needs to serve the organization's purpose, which should align with the needs of its customers. Now, getting these dimensions to align as a company grows and changes and gets bigger is not so easy. That's why being able to see how the structure of an organization is working is so helpful to leadership. It's difficult when you're inside a structure to get a look at how it's actually working. And this is where organizational constellation work is so helpful. OC, as we like to call it, can literally put the structure of an organization or a part of an organization on the floor or on the table and help you see how these elements are actually interacting with each other. So there are ways of helping us see, do we have a congruent structure for our company? Does it actually meet the needs of our customers? Are we aligned with the purpose, or is something else going on? If you'd like to learn more about this way of working, we have a training that we offer through the Human Systems Institute. It starts October 22nd. And it's a pretty comprehensive view of both how human beings behave in organizations and what kinds of structures are necessary for us to have functional organizations. So hopefully you can see this little screen here. So we have the Organizational Constellation online course that starts October 2nd. We also have one for people who work with families, which also have structures that need to be functional. And that starts on the 23rd. And if you want to see me working, just to see how I work, I have a workshop on October 15th that's focused on couple dynamics. How does the structure of that relationship work? So I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion of structure, and it's given you some food for thoughts. And I hope you'll be able to join us for one of our workshops in the future, or for one of our courses. Thank you for listening.